Hi everyone, I'm Kat Trago. I'm the president of the Wisconsin ACEDS chapter, and I appreciate and welcome all of you to the second session of this year's edition of the Midwest ACEDS series. During our last session, Paul Hagan of Epic, Jeff Chivers of Silo, and Julie Brown of Voorhees provided a fantastic lead into the current state of AI and some glimpses into agentic AI and where we're going next. And if you're interested in viewing the recording from that session, you can access the recording, session materials, and all of that kind of thing from our website, which ACEDS has created for the series. And I'll put a link to that website in the chat. But if you haven't registered yet for the remaining 4 sessions of the series, you can also find the registration links on that website as well. Our next session will feature forensic experts who will help us dig into how to differentiate between what's real and what is AI generated. So please, additionally, please stay to the end of today's program. Doug Austin of eDiscovery Today has provided some very interesting statistics, materials, and observations regarding the use of AI in eDiscovery. Please note he has also released several recent white papers on AI, in our industry, and that can be requested from the eDiscovery Today website. Today, we have a fantastic panel of practitioners who are currently using AI in their practice, and I'm going to turn things over to Angela in just a minute to kick things off for today's discussion. But before I do, I just want to mention that this series is a group effort for members of the Chicago, Denver, Detroit, Ohio, and Wisconsin chapters. A special thank you to Angela Shapiro and Amy Melbing of the Detroit chapter who took the lead on today's session. I also want to thank Jake Bell of NextPoint, who's sponsoring and administering the CLE credit applications for Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, and Iowa. If you're interested in receiving CLE for this session, please send Jake Bell a direct message in the chat with your name, state, and bar number. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Angela.
Thank you, Kat. Hi, everyone. As Kat mentioned, I'm Angela Shapiro. I am a board member with the ACEDS Detroit chapter, and I'm thrilled to be here today. And I'm particularly thrilled to have the panel that I get to share with you as we talk about AI in actual everyday use in eDiscovery, what works and what doesn't work, and why. Our goal is to give you a framework that you can walk away with and apply to your daily workflows in eDiscovery to make this it's not the easy button, but to make it as close as it can be while understanding the risks and the work behind that. So before we jump into our slide deck, I want to allow my panelists to introduce themselves. First, I'll just give you their names, and then we'll turn it over to them before we start the slides. We are fortunate to have Martha Laux with us today from McDermott. Martha brings a wealth of experience. I'll let her give you a little more info on her background in a moment. Also, Joel Henry Mansfield from Nationwide, another leader in the eDiscovery industry that we are thrilled to have with us. And Brandon Mack, who works with Kat, actually, but another just titan in this area. So we have a absolutely fabulous panel today. And before we jump in, why don't we start with you, Martha, if you want to give us a few words about yourself.
Sure, thanks. So in my role today, I'm Managing Director of Discovery Technology Services at McDermott. So my team really helps the attorneys at the firm use technology to do discovery effectively for the firm's clients. You know, we try to use all of the tools at our disposal to get the best result possible. And my background is originally I studied political science. I dabbled in paralegalism for a couple of years, went to law school briefly, decided that wasn't my path, and then I've ended up in eDiscovery ever since, and it just keeps changing, and it's a fascinating field. So I'm excited to join all of you guys today.
Thank you. Brandon?
My name is Brandon Mack. I work with the law firm Tannen Holson Marr based out of DC. My background, I have been in the e-discovery industry for a little over 20 years. Started out practicing and kind of stumbled my way into e-discovery. And I spent most of that focused on review, and then the last 10 years or so focused on the use of analytics and support of review and ECA and everything we do in e-discovery, really. The firm, Tannenholz, that I work with now, we are an e-discovery boutique firm with a strong focus on document review. So my role here is really about the use of analytics, vetting analytics tools, AI tools, and figuring out how can we best integrate them into the services we provide to our clients.
Thank you. Joel Henry?
Yeah, thanks, Angela. My name is Joel Henry Mansfield. I work for Nationwide Mutual Insurance Company. I serve as the pleasure and privilege of serving as managing counsel leading our in-house e-discovery unit, discovery management unit. We provide, excuse me, we provide litigation support to the entire corporate litigation portfolio across all of the EDRM. So everything from information governance all the way through collection, processing, review, exhibits, remediation, you name it. It's all done in-house. And I've been with Nationwide for about 7 years, 4 months, and 15 days, about. And before that, I actually worked as a project management counsel for an LSP, legal service provider, doing document review and other litigation support services for very large, complex litigation matters. Pleasure to be here today.
Thank you. And I'll just add, in addition to being here in my role as a board member with ACEDS Detroit chapter, I'm also a litigation attorney with Butzel Long. We are a law firm based out of Detroit, Michigan. And in addition to litigation, I had our firm's e-discovery practice to make sure that we are always, up to date on what can be done and how best to meet our clients' needs efficiently and effectively. So with that, we'll go ahead and jump on in. I'm going to share my screen. Can everyone see okay?
I can see it.
All right, excellent. So generative AI and e-discovery, what works, what doesn't, and why? I mentioned giving an overview that you can walk away with, and this is kind of what we came up with. So you can see on the left, we have our three use cases that we're going to walk through today: early case assessment, document review, and case development. So all three of those are things that, in the e-discovery world, we're constantly dealing with. And each of those has the different steps when you're talking about the use of generative AI to help accelerate or otherwise impact your workflow. Really, it does break down into these steps: defining the task, preparing, your prompting, iterations, and proof. So you'll see that going across the top, right? So that is something that has to, each of those steps applies in each of these three use cases. It's not linear, though. We had to lay it out in a linear fashion so you have something to walk away with. But this really does, you double back, you bounce around, you go, it is part of that iterative column. Really, the whole entire chart is iterative. So you will see we organized to kind of mirror these themes as we go through, and we'll have this chart again at the end for our final reference, and it will be available on the series website as well, the ACEDS Midwest Chapter Series website after this. I'll also mention that because of the bouncing around between those different concepts as you go through these different use cases, it is most likely that if you have a question, we're probably organically going to get there, or at least there's a good chance as we walk through some of these other use cases. So we are going to save questions for the end, but feel free to type them in as you go so that you don't lose thought of your or lose track of your thought if you would like to. And if we don't organically address it, we will make sure we get it done at the end. So just some background concepts that informed our work as we were preparing for today. Generative AI is entering litigation workflows rapidly. You all know that. It's not entering, it has entered. That is there. We are seeing that there are some real efficiency gains to be had in some areas, but there are also problems. There are unstable outputs or unsupported conclusions that we have to be anticipating and working to avoid where we can, or understanding where we can't and what to do about that. But really, the difference in outcomes many times is tied to the workflow design rather than to the underlying tool. Both are important, but what we're really focusing on today is that workflow design. So what happens and is problematic often is that many teams will treat generative AI like it's Google, and that is not going to get us where we need to be. And it is more like a drafting assistant in some instances, or an assistant in general, but it does work best when it's integrated into a structured workflow like the one that we talked about, because without that, you're going to see our AI models filling gaps in ways that where it's trying to please us. And I see Martha nodding right now at that last statement. Martha, what are your thoughts about these common mistakes?
Well, you've mentioned a few times it's the workflow, and I feel very strongly that that is very, very correct and true. When we embark on a large e-discovery project, or frankly, even a mid-size e-discovery project, when we design the approach that we take, we look at the handoffs between people, how the work flows through the steps
Right.
of our process. And we then use numbers to estimate the amount of time, to assess the quality. So we gather metrics to assess how effective any given workflow or approach is. And it's about transparency into what is happening through your process. And I think it applies to whether it's machine learning, generative AI, or other analytical tools. These are foundational principles that apply regardless of the technology and the nature of the matter.
And it's critical, isn't it, to not just for us to understand this, but for us to be able to explain it to our those we're working with so that they have a real understanding of what's realistic and what's required to get us to the end point. So again, this is just another way of looking at the same workflow spelled out one last time before we dive into our first use case, which is going to be early case assessment. So if we take that first portion of our chart, which is defining the task in front of us, right? There are different things that we're looking to accomplish, or that we may be looking to accomplish as part of ECA, where we may hope to involve AI to get us to the endpoint faster, more efficiently, more accurately, even in times. But really understanding and having a clear definition of that task is going to be important. Knowing what can and can't be done here, this is partly understanding your tool as well, but really having a very clear definition that all of your stakeholders agree on before you jump in is going to be a critical first step. And then this is a step where I think a lot of people jump right past this. And in fact, a lot of the e-discovery platforms um, almost make it really enhances the desire to jump right past it, because they can skip over it themselves. You may have to take extra steps to get into this if you're in with certain platforms that you're using. But it is critical. If your data is not prepped, you will not get the outputs that you're looking for, and you will get inaccurate information, and you will waste time as opposed to saving it. And everyone on this panel is nodding, because we've talked about this multiple times. This is a critical step and something that we see skipped a lot. Brandon, would you like to kind of throw out a few words of advice on this, or your wisdom in regards to preparing the data?
Sure. I mean, it's always been important, no matter what e-discovery process you're going through or what tool you're using, to prep the data. It requires you to understand what is the system seeing from the data that you're giving it. So when we talk about prepping data, what you're really doing is you're building the input that the system's going to be evaluating. And if you're asking questions about data that you've given it that's a little bit messy, you're going to get messy answers. And that garbage in, garbage out, we've heard it, throughout all time when it comes to working with computers and computer programs. Gen AI is not a wizard at fixing your garbage that you give it. We'd like to think that it is, and you might be able to prompt it in certain ways where it cleans up a certain number of things. But going back to the point of having an established workflow, one of the important things about having an established workflow and plugging this into that workflow is that you don't have to rely on the system to make up for your shortcomings as you're preparing to give it a task to do. And we'll talk in more depth about when you get to the stage of actually prompting or giving the system a task, what that looks like and how you do it. But before you even get there, you want to make sure that as much as your instructions are clear, the data that you're giving it that it's going to act on is just as clear. So there's not miscommunications between you and the system when you're then giving it instructions and tasks on what to do with it.
So it sounds like that requires an understanding of your data before you jump
It does.
in. Would that be fair? So that,
Absolutely. Yes.
yeah, we're constantly telling colleagues, clients, whomever, that it's important that we understand the data, where it lives before it's collected, how it's collected, all of those things. And that remains true. That has been true, but it remains true and has added import when we're dealing with these types of tools, because we do need to understand not just what we're seeing, but the metadata behind it to know what is going to be possible and where there are pitfalls that may exist.
But I know, Martha, I know you're looking to jump in. If I can add one more point before we get to that, this might be the first point where we're talking about that circular workflow, Angela, where you're going back, because you can
Yep.
just as easily use Gen AI to help you do that ferreting out of details about your data set. You're trying to get used to what this data is, not just, textually, not just what are the contents, the subjective contents of the data, but tell me more about this set. Where we
Right.
used to just sample by running searches and pulling and looking at documents, we can also put Gen AI to use there in helping us evaluate those samples or take broader samples and get an idea of what's in the data set. Now I'll shut
Excellent
up, Martha.
point.
Sorry, I just get very excited about data processing. It's that's what this is really referring to. And I just want to underscore the importance of it because that garbage out, garbage in thing is very, very real. If you do not clean your data by processing, extracting the text, normalizing information, etc., you will spend more time managing those files and managing that information. Skipping this step leads to more hours down the line. So it
Absolutely.
is that important. This has downstream consequences for the entirety of your project.
And for those, there is a temptation to jump straight ahead in when you're using AI and to jump past this and to jump past a lot of other steps that we're going to talk about and get right to the results. If you are doing that with dirty data, with data that has not been prepared this way, then you just using a very simple example, let's say that you are running an investigation and what happened when the sequence of events is critical. If you don't have normalized, I'm looking at our slide, normalized timestamps and metadata, or if your dates are not with the same time zone, it hasn't been processed with the same time zone, or that's not otherwise accounted for, you could end up with your case team believing that they have a smoking gun because something happened just before something else, when in fact it happened afterward. And that is a real example that has happened. So, fortunately, not to me, but to somebody that I'm close to. So I've heard all about it. So, I think we hit on that again later on as an example. But it is because that's an easy example to understand. But that same sort of implication is there with every part of the data prep. If it is overlooked, there is that potential not just to end up making more time down the road instead of becoming efficient, it becomes a burden, but also having very incorrect output. Prompting. So prompting is something that we're all hearing a lot about. I mean, with AI in every context, not just in e-discovery, but that's because it's critical. That is how we're instructing. That's how we're interfacing. That is where our what we want to see as output is being communicated to our tool. So there are various best practices for prompting. You'll see them all over. There are entire not just webinars, but classes that are taught on how to prompt. Many, many materials out there on how to prompt. And it is something that everyone should spend time understanding and perfecting. But this is another area where the iteration comes in because you're going to prompt, and that may change even going back to your definition stage, defining what your task. So prompting though, when you are doing it for an early case assessment or an ESA or ECA, I'm sorry, workflow, there are some things I like to do. And I will mention that it's not possible in every tool to do all of these things the way that I would like for it to do. So some of these are their best practices, and you may have to have a workaround depending on your tool to get as close as you can. But I want to ask it to require document IDs for all assertions. If it is making an assertion, I want it to give me a document ID, or even better, link me to the underlying material that is supporting that assertion, where it is coming from. And this is going to go to another part of our workflow when we have to later look at the proofs or verifications. We are going to have to do that. So I want to make that easy. I'm not going to take blind assertions from any generative AI. I wouldn't take a blind assertion from an associate either. I want to see the proof for myself so that I can do that verification and I can satisfy my ethical obligation by doing that. I want quotations for supporting text, actual quotations. I do not want to have shorthand because very often when you hear about hallucination, yes, you will see cases where courts are dealing with entire case citations and cases that are being hallucinated. But what is more common than that and flies under the radar maybe a little more often is when a summary of what a case stands for or what evidence stands for is prepared and it's just not correct. They're missing the point. There is some context that is not being picked up by that generative AI that is important to what it stands for, what the underlying material stands for. So I want to see quotations. I don't just want to see summarized text for those critical points in particular. Limiting analysis to define document sets. So if you have a very large data set, this is going to become potentially important, or if there's particular areas of interest, you're going to give that instruction as a part of that. How do you want to limit? Where are you looking to limit? And then allow the model to identify missing or unclear evidence. So this is something that was hit on a little bit ago. Use the model to your advantage to help assess some of these things as well. Joel Henry, what are your thoughts on prompting? Do you have anything that you like to see included in particular?
Yeah, absolutely. And this speaks to that preparation phase that we talked about a couple minutes ago. Large language models, in my opinion, they make excellent Dunning-Kruger machines because the less they know about something, the more confident they are in giving you a result, right? And so you really have to prepare for that, right? You have to sort of preemptively attack it and defensively use your prompting, use your wording so that they can't make things up or so that they can't kind of do a run around your defined data set. One of the preparation phases that we didn't talk about, but one that is on my checklist from the beginning, every single time, make sure that they have access. Whatever model, whatever system or application you're using, make sure it has access to the data you want to look at, right? Not just the question of, are you limiting its access to things that it shouldn't see? Does it even have access to the things you want it to see? And another thing that doesn't come up very often, especially from the ECA side, right? If you're using a platform where you're uploading data, you know that it has access to the data. If you're using something that sits on top of, maybe it's an enterprise tool, right? And it sits on top of native in-place data. One question that you need to be aware of is how long does it take it to index that information? I've seen tools that can get it almost instantaneously within, a few minutes to an hour. I've seen other tools that can take upwards of a week to index and be aware of and an OCR and be ready to actually offer analytics. So understanding that time frame is going to be critical to knowing whether you have information that is ready for the analytical summarization, timeline crafting, whatever kind of insights you want to glean from it. Getting back to prompting, right? I think your framework here is fantastic. One of the other things I like to put in, because like you said, there's lots of resources out there about how to use effective prompting. No one is going to understand what is effective with the particular tool you're using. We're tool agnostic on this discussion, right? But better than you. So you have to iterate. You have to try, and it's a trial and error sort of a process. You'll see a lot of discussion out there about using certain types of techniques like role playing. A lot of people love to say, okay, you need to give it a role. You need to tell it you're going to be an expert on this sort of thing. Sometimes that helps, sometimes that doesn't. For me, it's more make sure that you understand my prompt. If you don't understand my questions, first stop your producing any kind of results and ask me for follow-up on the prompts that I've already given you, right? Tell me if you have a defined data set and define it for me. So I was just talking about this, right? Tell me all the things that you're aware that you have access to, you being the algorithm. And if there are any gaps, define them for me. Or when you are producing information, make sure you're noting those gaps so that I'm aware of them. Because the biggest problem here is not knowing what you don't know, right? Getting a black box result, looking at it and saying, well, it looks pretty good, right? And not understanding where the deficiencies or gaps are. So those are big prompt, kind of necessary checklist items for me. And then on top of all of that, we'll talk about this more later, right? The validation work is essential. So what I like to do with prompting, right? Again, we're going to talk about this in just a little bit, iterating. Take the results that you get from one system, especially for ECA, you may have access to multiple different models, and run it through a different model. Double check the work, right? One of the best ways to double check is to have one tool or model evaluate the results of another, and sort of critique it, and then take places where it finds issues, run them back through and say, hey, what about this? What did you miss this? Not only do I want you to re-prompt and to accommodate what you missed, but I want you to tell me why you missed it in the first place. That's one of the most critical parts of prompting, is understanding the reasoning behind, with the model's reasoning behind why it selects what it does and why it doesn't select. Which is funny because this, there's a lot of pressure to use new AI tools. A lot of people think it's kind of an easy button, right? But actually, it's more work than ever before in terms of really understanding the tool and how it's interacting with your data, if you want to get that ultimate return on investment.
That's one thing I tell people when they inevitably ask, are jobs going to be lost with this process that we're talking about today? And the answer is, I mean, yes, we are going to literally lose functions that we are currently using humans for. However, as you just mentioned, Joel Henry, there are different areas of these workflows that are going to require more knowledge, more people, more expertise. So start learning now, and being here today is a good start. But the prompting, one thing I did want to mention before I move off of this, because something you said, Joel Henry, reminded me, and it's come up in our panel discussions before. Using a different tool to help you develop your prompts can be very effective. So if you are asking a different tool to point out shortfalls or areas where there may be ambiguities or where there may be other pitfalls, that can be a very effective way to finalize your prompting, not just in this context, but in many contexts. All right, iteration. So we're going to refine our prompts going back and forth, especially if we do see that narrative drift, or we're going to adjust our document scope if we need to do that. We're going to test our outputs against known documents, and we're going to keep repeating that until we get some stability that we feel is defensible. And those are, again, concepts that have been present before generative AI, especially in e-discovery, because we have been dealing with other AI, pre-generative AI, for quite some time. We know a lot of these concepts from TAR and from other tools that have been available to us, but it becomes even more important here. And we've got to have proof. We have to verify. And more decisions have been coming out with frequency about the requirement to have humans in the loop, using attorneys using their credentials, using their education, their professional certification to verify output, especially before it's shared with the court. So we have to verify cited documents directly. Do we have to what does that mean? That's going to vary based on the case. It's going to vary based on the context. But we do have to put eyes on these cited documents and confirm that they are what they say they are. Does that mean every document in your review, or, well, in this case, in your ECA? No, but the critical ones, absolutely, you must. Confirming your timeline ordering against the metadata, that kind of goes back to something that we hit on a little while ago. And don't forget to look for omissions, right? So you're going to also check for key documents that you hopefully already know about to make sure they were all included, because if they weren't, then that is going to kick off the need to go back and revisit some earlier steps until we figure out why and how to get a better, more complete set.
One of the things that I like to maintain is a case log or a document log, right? Organized conceptually, so that you can think of the case strategy breaks down into these 3, 4, 5 basic concepts or categories. And then you look at the results that your prompts are generating, and they speak to maybe two of the three, so you know that there's an issue. And then within them, you have key facts, right? Again, this is all either pre-work or concurrent work, manual work that you are doing that's testing the strength of your analytical tool, your algorithm, right? Because your algorithm is generating input for you, and then you are putting it within the conceptual framework to make sure that it's a smell test, make sure that it makes sense. And that's where that iteration part comes in, because there AI tools, at least in my, this is different from like the old TAR 1.0, 2.0 types of tools where you train it, you're going to get everything back that meets those criteria within reason, right? Here, what I've noticed, especially with large language models, is that they tend to have diminishing returns. The larger the data set, the more it starts to kind of stray from the prompt or what your original intention is. And so that's where it's really critical to go in and check and see, is it hitting on the things that you expect it to hit? And are there places where there are gaps? And if there are, you need to break your prompts down and say, instead of look at this entire data set, everything in here, just tell me what happened. That's the dream quote. That's the dream prompt, right? You can't do that. You need to say very specifically, look for documents, records dealing with issue 1. Here's the find issue 1. Pull everything back. All right, now let's look at issue 2. Then if the two interact, all right, now tell me all the things that overlap between issues 1 and 2. So you are building a pyramid of more data, and then you're getting smaller and smaller, narrower and narrower as you're focusing your issues. It's manual work, but you have to do it. Otherwise, you won't know where you're missing things.
I would also add a couple of tips on prompting, and I think it applies irrespective of when you're prompting or what tool or how. Ask the system to interrogate the results or interrogate your prompt. Ask it to criticize the output so that you can use that information to better refine your workflow. And then incidentally, and maybe this is, I read an article a few weeks ago and I've been trying this tip ever since, and it's kind of weird. But sometimes if I get a little bit belligerent in my prompting and kind of insult it, I use Claude on my personal. Sometimes I'll insult him and call him Tommy or something. And you know what? He performs better when I insult him. And I wonder if it's because these LLMs are trained on the internet, which is kind of mean. I don't know. But for whatever reason, I have had some success in being a little bit rude.
No, I think that's same. And
Okay.
also, I will tell it, you can tell your AI, and I'm kind of going outside of the ECA use case for a moment because this really is more when I'm using a general assistant, but um, it wants to make you happy, and it's going to try to um, kiss up to you in a lot of ways. And I don't want that. I don't want it to try, tell me what it thinks I want to hear. I want it to tell me what I'm actually asking, and if it can't, I want it to tell me that, and hopefully why. So I am constantly giving those instructions. Don't blow smoke. Don't try to
Yeah.
make me happy. Just give it to me blunt. So that's a good point and an interesting one in terms of why does our AI interact differently based on how we treat it? And then you get the whole question of, do we want to be too rude? Because then what are we going to do if it ends up running the world someday? I
Roku's
don't want to make it
basilisk
too
might come
mad.
forward.
But all right. So just to summarize a little bit about what we've talked about in the ECA context, what works, document grounded summaries, bounded data set analysis, not this wide, tell me everything based on everything in there. What fails, summarize the case, tell me what's important. There's without the work that we've talked about before, or narrative conclusions about intent or causation. Again, you really you need proof and you need facts. You don't want this kind of um, gut check from an AI tool. You can't take that and do anything with it. This is a system where especially, well, maybe not especially at ECA, but definitely at ECA, this is a time where we really need to understand the facts and use the tools where we can before we head into our next stage, document review, the one that keeps a lot of us up at night sometimes.
Angela, sorry,
And,
before you
and
go
just
on,
to
just
drill,
one. Oh, I'm sorry, Martha, go ahead.
I was just going to say what Angela said is just so important. We cannot walk past it. It's about the facts. That is literally the point of discovery. We are discovering the facts. So it could not possibly be more integral to this phase of a case.
I completely
Absolutely.
agree. One, again, sort of tip or trick I wanted to mention here is that it is a little different. You know, you're taught, it's like law school 101, right? When you're doing a deposition or you're doing a, into cross-examining someone, right? You know, you're not supposed to lead them. You're supposed to ask open-ended questions, especially in a depo, because you're eliciting information, right? And that is true. You don't want to lead the system to a foregone conclusion. But I think it also cuts the other way as well. You can get better results if you ask the system, like, what happened here? Give me a summary of all the major facts and put them in a timeline, right? You may get better results if you tell it something a little bit more guided, like pull back all the information, all the facts, and report them in a timeline or report them in a one pager that speak to this specific issue. Was there an intentional breach of contract? Find all the, if you just ask it, was there intentional breach of contract? It'll say
Right.
yes or no, and it'll just give you a narrative response. You won't know if it's true. But if you ask it to find the information that speaks to a specific issue, give it a little bit of a leading kind of guidance, it will actually do better because it knows what it's looking for. So that's, again, that I think is a little bit different from how we typically would approach that kind of fact-finding exercise.
Fair. All right, document review, everyone's favorite. So again, we start back at the beginning of our task list, defining the task for a review. There's different things we can be using AI to assist with at this stage. We can have it assist reviewers with drafting or with organization. We can have it draft coding rationales or suggestions, and at times. And I'll mention again, different tools, different abilities in these regards, or different outputs in these regards. So these are things that you're looking for and can hopefully accomplish with your tool. Summarizing documents for reviewer context. So not replacing reviewers across the board here with this step, but assisting. And privilege log, probably the favorite use that most of us look forward to eventually being perfected, and where there's a lot of danger, but also a lot of benefit that can be had. So drafting privilege log descriptions, helping to normalize your privilege log entries is also a very good use of it. Privilege logging is a huge pain point, and that is an area where there's a lot of benefit to be had, but all of these are tasks. And again, it is critical when you're defining your task, what it is that you're hoping to accomplish, that you get buy-in and understanding from all of the stakeholders. Everybody understands what can and cannot be expected with the task that you guys settle on. So we, again, preparing the data, preparing the tool, in addition to preparing the ECA data that we've already talked about, or the prep that was done at that stage, we have to again revisit and consider what needs to be prepared here. And that includes defining our responsiveness criteria if we're using it in a way that impacts a responsiveness query. Defining our issue tags, what they mean, how they're going to be used or worked. If you're doing privilege, well, I mean, everything is going to touch on privilege. Not everything, most everything touches on privilege in some way. So identifying those privilege indicators and making sure that we understand those, and preparing example documents for testing prompts. Again, lots of preparation. You cannot skip this stage. It is not even arguably, it is the most important stage. If you fall on this stage in any of our workflows, the entire thing falls apart. And Brandon and Martha, I can see you're both eager to add here. So Brandon, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I would just say this, when you look at this slide and the things that are going on here in this slide, every one of those boxes is something that becomes infinitely easier if you did your ECA step properly. I mean,
That's right.
really understanding not just what the responsiveness criteria are based on the core documents you have, a review protocol you may have, or whatever else may be there, but also with some insight into what's actually in the data, you can now match the concept of responsiveness to the types of data that you're seeing, which you learned during ECA, makes it so much easier for you to draft prompts that lead to a good review, like what Joel Henry was just talking about, a more pointed prompt that is asking the system not this wholesale, I've asked 20 questions in one prompt thing. I've given the system, here are the responsiveness criteria, and are just two or three very solid indicators that you're looking for. And you can do these in separate prompts. You can do them all in one prompt, however you want, but you condense that prompt because of the way that you've gained knowledge about what's in the data set, not just what you're looking for sort of in the ether before you knew it was actually collected. So these stages really, if you've done the ECA right, these get so much easier. And because these are now easy, the way you're going to build a prompt that leads to a successful review, it almost comes together on its own. I don't That's
It
going back to
does.
easy button world, but it comes together much more easily than if you didn't do that underlying foundational work of a very strong ECA.
I'll mention because there are certainly projects where ECA is being combined with review. They're happening together at the same time. And when that does happen, it is critical that all of those things we talked about at the ECA stage, they're not just skipped past, they need to be incorporated here when you're doing your review steps. Martha, I know you also had something to say on this.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit of color to a couple of things that are on the slide here and provide some concrete things to think about. So when you say define issue tags operationally, I think what that means in practice is when I've got a set of documents, you want to think about a tag is a feature of your data set that you will use to kind of slice and dice your data in different directions. So I'd like to think of issues in a binary way where I define the issue in such a way that it's a yes, no type of answer for like a document. And that way I can group things into different combinations of features. All right. Privilege indicators, that's specifically things like domains, which might be law firm domains, names of attorneys, and things of that nature. And then when you're preparing example documents for testing prompts, consider your sample approach and whether your sample is representative of the whole set of documents that you're pulling from. So is it statistically significant? Is there a confidence, interval or margin of error to your sample approach? So just in concrete terms, I think those are factors that you should consider for these kind of broader areas that are identified in this slide.
Agreed. So we come back to prompting because we always do. Prompting when you're dealing with review and when you're asking the AI to play a role in that review it is never going to be your first prompt, or it shouldn't be your first prompt in this instance. So you're again going to be asking it to do the same things that we asked at the ECA stage or that we discussed at the ECA stage. You want to have quotations from supporting language. You want to have citations. You want to have all of the things that will allow us to get to verification when we need to at that step. You want to embed your review criteria directly into the prompt very clearly. And that is one where, again, we're constantly kind of bouncing around between these different steps, but you're going to have to check and make sure that it's being applied correctly and doesn't need to be modified there as well. And specifying the structured output formats. So you're telling it right in the prompt what you want as the output, what it should look like, how it should, what it needs to include. So prompting, again, very important, and not every single one of us on here prompts differently. I can say that, I think, with pretty good confidence. But that's because we have learned what works for us with our tools and what works for us with just the way that we think and interact with our tools. So it's not something that we can tell you do X, Y, and Z. We can tell you what to make sure that you're including and considering as you go through. And then you're going to have to do the practice. You're going to have to do the testing, and you're going to have to do the verification on every single case. We get back to iterating again. We're going to test those prompts against known responsive documents, just like we talked about at this ECA stage. We're going to, and I will say this also, this can be, there is likely some subsection of documents that you have humans reviewing even as you have your AI going. That is likely in many cases, in many contexts. So one of the goals from that is we want to find these documents that we can use to test, because if you don't know, you don't know. So let's get those documents so we can test the prompts against those known responsiveness documents, adjust our prompts as we need to reduce false positives, and to address omissions as well that we are uncovering, and validate our outputs against reviewer decisions. Again, you often will have a subset of documents where we do have some reviewer decisions. And really without that, you're going to have a hard time with a lot of the rest of these validating and testing and proving. So once you have your output, you do have to still verify your quoted language against the actual document. It's giving you quotes, hopefully, and you are able to go back and do that. You are looking at the documents it is pointing to. You are confirming that reviewer decisions are consistent where you have them, and if they're not, you're figuring out why. And if it is an issue with the AI side of it, then you're addressing that. I mean, if it's an issue with the human side, you're addressing that too, just outside of that
And
workflow.
in all honesty, you may very well discover in this time, and frankly, this is likely the time that you're going to discover that your data has not been cleaned well enough, or
That's
that,
true.
that it's like, well, I know this should have happened because I talked to my client about it, but I cannot find the evidence. Well, maybe it's really bad OCR. If the
Right.
system is just reading the OCR, if it's not a vision model looking at an image, then that could present a challenge for the technology. So this
Yep.
is you may have to iterate yourself all the way back to your data prep.
Absolutely. Or you may find out that there's a limitation in the tool that is now having effect. So just as an example, you may have a tool where it is incapable of really utilizing a very lengthy thread that's represented on a single document, for example. So if something important happens outside of the text that it's considering, it's not there. You're not going to see it there. So understanding those limitations of your tool and matching it up at data prep is important for that reason as well. And this is the stage proof where you're going to find errors, or you're going to find holes from different stages throughout all of those stages that we talk about on those. Ensuring privilege determinations are reviewed by attorneys. I cannot stress this enough. If you want to avoid sanctions, please make sure that that one of your attorneys is looking at your privilege log and is looking at your privilege determinations and making sure that they're accurate. Does that mean they have to redo the log? No, but you do have to test these things. You have to look back at them and ensure that what you are representing as privileged truly meets that criteria. Um, that is because that's a frequently scrutinized part of our workflows and contentious part of our workflows. That's why, to me, it's not just an ethical obligation, although it is an ethical obligation, but it is really one where none of us wants to be the example case that is being cited on these webinars of someone who failed to do this. So do it. Just do it.
Well, and calculate your risks, right? There are ideally, these tools should be used to enhance judgment, not replace judgment, right? But if you're short on time or short on budget or whatever, right? Think about the things that are less likely to get you into trouble. Extracting entities and identifying privilege criteria is just something for a human to do. Verifying judgment calls by the AI where it's identifying privileged or sensitive material, humans should be doing that. Drafting summaries for the Privlog, that's something that a AI tool is great at.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely agree.
Really easy to double check, right? So think about where its strengths are, because ultimately, it's a machine, right? I don't know if we have time for a war story, but there's the machines are going to work off of, no matter how conversational they seem, they're still just machines, and they're going to operate off of instructions, right? And so you have to be, one of the other things you have to be careful of is has your understanding has the human's understanding of the case changed? Do you have a Q&A log or something where, the original prompts, which were based off of review guidelines or protocols or agreed upon search terms or whatever, have they shifted over time? And if they did you remember to go back and iterate and tell the prompts and adjust them? Because if you didn't, the prompts are only as good as the input that they're given, right? And so that's often, in my experience, I've seen this happen actually with one of our cases where, our understanding had shifted over time. It was a little bit broader than what we originally said. And there was a word that we used, directly connects to, directly relates to. And it wasn't finding some things. And you go back in, you actually ask it, explain your work. Tell me why you didn't find these documents. And it was like, well, because you said directly. And these don't directly relate to that issue. So you can ask it, just ask the system, tell me why. And actually it does a pretty good job of explaining its rationale. And it turns out it was behaving perfectly reasonably, just bad instructions from the human side.
So again, we've got some what works and what fails in this context, the review context, and we've hit on all of these as we were speaking, so I won't read them to you, but you will have that available to you in the slide deck on the website later. Which brings us to our final use case, which is case and factual development. How do we use those facts? How do we use those documents to tell our story, to develop our story? And again, where we're defining our tasks, so we are helping our attorneys move from documents to case understanding, summarizing out of evidence, identifying key events, generating possible case theories, helping to develop those and to support those with the documents. Those are all tasks that are available as case development. Even simple chronologies are part of case development. Those are all things that are available tasks. But again, we're going to have to start with prep. Always, we are going to have to start, go right back again to prep, the same that we did for ECA, the same that we did for review. And we are going to, this is where I'd mentioned we're going to start getting repetitive because we do go back through the same steps and many of them are similar. It's just a different focus as we are moving into them. And that is certainly the case here as well. Prompting again, and I think to me, this is kind of the most fun place to prompt when you're doing case development, just because you can get a little more creative, I suppose. We've done the fact inquiries. This is kind of helping to apply those facts to possible theories. And so it can be fun. It really can. I mean, all of this can be fun. And if you don't think it is, then you probably shouldn't do e-discovery.
The challenge you'll run into, though, and this is something that we just deal with in discovery, we all live in a pretty fragmented information environment. Like if you just think about how many places you communicate in a given day, you're probably on your personal email, your work email, text messages, maybe you've got WhatsApp, there's message functions on LinkedIn, or whatever platform you're using. And sometimes the information that fills in your evidentiary holes is not inside of the document or the communication itself. It's in the metadata around it that reveals the activity of the actor over time. So sometimes if you're running into a wall and you can't find a document that, tells your story or supports your conclusion, the information you're looking for could be in the data, like a
Right.
non-document. Although I feel like the distinction between data and document is a little bit false at this point in history with all of our technologies. So just consider metadata is information, just like document is information.
Absolutely. And the AI can see it. The AI can work with that metadata a lot easier than we can, frankly, in most review protocols.
Sometimes.
Okay, you're right. I
It
shouldn't
depends. It
overstate.
depends. It depends. I couldn't go one presentation without saying it depends. It depends on whether that metadata is indexed
No,
and is
that's
searchable in the entirety
okay.
of
So
what
again,
you're applying.
understanding your tool and understanding your settings and how you've prepared both the data and the settings. Yeah, absolutely.
It's,
Something
I'd
you said.
also,
Go ahead, Brandon.
I would just say, I'd also like to say, if we I keep talking about this sort of circular or the building blocks of what we've been talking about here. When we first started talking about review and we were discussing how you structure your responsiveness criteria and your issue tags, all of that now feeds into this portion of the process where you've got to review data set. It used to be 5, 10 years ago, you get a review data set. It's just responsive, not responsive, and a bunch
Right.
of buckets of different tags. If you've done that logically with the ECA work you did to start out with and the structure of the review that you moved on to next, you now have those different segments of documents you can point an AI at specific topics or fact development that you want it to do. And it can be remarkably effective at not looking at a 100,000 document data set, but looking at these 5,000 documents that pertain
Right.
to these two facts and give me a thorough summary. Tell me
Right.
everything that went on. Tell me, does this fit my theory of the case based on these
Right.
factors? All those things become so much simpler and so much more effective at this stage if you've followed the steps we've talked about in the previous stages of what you're doing with
Absolutely.
the AI.
Or
Yeah.
use it twice. Use it once against that
Yes. Yeah.
that bounded set and use it against the larger and ask it if there's anything it spots that might be
Yeah.
a potential problem or a hole or contrary to what you've come up with. I think
Definitely.
that's a fabulous use as well. So iterating, that's if you walk away with one word that summarizes our presentation, it's iteration, I think. So you're going to have to keep redoing that. You're going to test competing explanations. So if you're going to use a theory, then you're going to have to test the converse of that as well. Refine your prompts again to reduce narrative drift. Evaluating outputs against the document record cannot overstate that you must be evaluating and proving, which brings us to proof. Verifying the supporting documents, looking for contradictory evidence. Do not hand off to the trial team just the good stuff. They need to know about the bad stuff too. So make sure you're doing that as well. And also looking for things that contradict your summaries or that contradict what you and the AI working with you have come up with it in terms of your narrative, that everything remains evidence grounded. And we get back to what works and what doesn't. Sounds very similar to the earlier stages because it is very similar to the earlier stages. What works is evidence grounded summaries. Here we're getting into hypotheses, so making sure that those are generated and tied to underlying documents that we have looked at and confirmed. Again, every document, no. The important ones, yes, absolutely. Narrative synthesis beyond the evidence, that's a fail. That's also just not something I would use these tools for. I might use generative AI, but it's not going to be in a review platform most likely for some of that. Which does remind me though, using those other AI tools, as I mentioned earlier with prompting, there is a role for that in your overall day-to-day work. Using those to help this process become better is fine. I am a huge fan of using whatever you have secure access to, whether that's enterprise versions of Copilot or some protege with Lexis, whatever it is that you have, use that to help you to define for every stage of this, actually, you can use it to help you with the planning, the preparing, the prompting. I mentioned earlier, sometimes it is the tool, sometimes it's not the process. So here are some examples of times when it's the tool that may be the problem. Your context window can truncate long email threads, which I hit on earlier. Knowing those limitations is important. You may you may run identical prompts and get inconsistent answers, and that can be a problem and is something that points to an underlying issue that you're going to have to go back and figure out. Um, all of these really, these are all things that the tool, if the tool is the actual problem, you can eliminate that it is part of the prompting is a problem or the data prep is a problem, but it is the actual tool. Your task that you've defined for that tool isn't going to be complete. You can't use that tool for that task. It's really that simple. The tool is not made for that task, even if it's marketed for that task. I'll add. So a couple of war stories that we'll run through very quickly, and then I want to get to Doug's 5 minutes because it's his video is interesting. We got to preview it yesterday. Convincing but wrong narrative. AI is great at being convincing but wrong. It is. So AI summary claims engineers warned leadership about a document or about a defect when documents only discussed testing delays, not defect, but delays. So there was some That's an example of verifying those citations, not relying on generative summaries. Go to the document. If it's being used to support the idea that there were defects, but you look at the actual document and they're just talking about issues related to delays, you need to know that and you don't want to pass that forward. Timeline failure, this is one I hit on briefly earlier, metadata normalization, timing when you're doing anything that is critical to understand when something happened. You're going to have to make sure that your data is set up in that way. Prompting, tell the story of what happened, and it's going to tell you, it's going to make up a story and tell you what it thinks you want to hear happened. And that is an overall AI problem. So again, we're going to leave you with our cheat sheet, the framework that you walk through for every single for every use case. And I'll say, this goes beyond even e-discovery. You can use this same workflow or this same cheat sheet to walk you through every step of what you should be considering and doing when you're using AI in your practice at all. So that is what we'll leave you with there. Did we have questions we should address before?
We do.
Oh, we have a lot in chat. Okay.
Yep, we have a couple questions. The first is ECA discoverable?
So it is what we do during ECA discoverable? Or is that the question?
The question is ECA discoverable? Yeah.
I
Am I
would
getting it
assume that as long as the activity that you are doing for early case assessment is done at the directive of an attorney, that the privilege would protect that.
So I'm gonna give a qualifier because
Yeah.
early case assessment done by your legal team in these platforms is typically not going to be the subject of discovery. Now, if something comes up as there is a problem, if you run into a situation where something makes it to court that shouldn't have made it to court, and someone along the line is going to point back at the AI or point back at the ECA efforts as the reason that happened, yeah, that's going to end up being discoverable. But I want to give a different situation, and that is where our clients are trying to involve themselves in ECA, essentially assess early case assessment, assessing documents, assessing risk, even assessing the strengths and weaknesses of the case. And they're doing that with their own tools, which are often not those tools that have the confidentiality protections contractually that we want to be using or that we should be using. So in those cases, when they are putting in information and requests and it's relevant and it would otherwise be the subject of discovery or disclosure, yeah, that could very well be. It's going to have to be considered for discovery and for disclosure, whether or not there's going to be a privilege that can attach or work product that can attach becomes really dicey. And there have already been a couple of decisions that's waived. So will that then have to go? Yeah. I mean, I was just looking at a Celebrate report for a cell phone that included in the chat included a ton of chats with Chat GPT. Some of them are relevant to the case and are going to have to be considered. So that is a new area of to be aware of as we're going forward, and assume that everything you do in these workflows is going to be called on to be defended, if not the subject to formal discovery. And that is something that we've always done anyway. Documentation. And I will add, understanding what documentation your tools provide versus that you will need to yourself do is important as well. Because part of defensibility is being able to explain what we did.
Another
there's a
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. There's a big pitfall here, right? Especially from an in-house perspective, because traditionally, when there was a litigation matter, right, some allegation of liability, where would you go? You go to your in-house legal team, right, or your outside counsel, and you would talk to them. Hey, is there really risk here? Is there liability? All those communications are going to be privileged, right? Now, if you have some overzealous person inside the business who's like, well, I need to know if we even have this problem. I'm going to go ask our in-house large language model to go do some searches for me. You could argue that that is privileged if you know that those exist. But you might collect that person's mail file, and maybe all their prompts and responses live in their mail file. There are definitely certain very large generative AI tools where that is the case, and they don't have any attorneys anywhere near those emails or those prompts or messages. Right? They may look like emails, but they have no legal context to them whatsoever. And so if you're relying on another model to identify all the privileged material, you may not find those. And all that very damaging, potentially risky material now becomes discoverable, not because you can't protect it. You could say, oh, maybe this was, all these inquiries were made at the insistence of counsel or in order to facilitate requests to counsel, right? But because you didn't know about them in the first place.
So we have a question.
Yeah, these
Go ahead, Martha.
one thing,
Sorry.
yeah, from a discovery perspective, these chat platforms, if everybody's downloading Claude, OpenAI, Gemini, I pick the thing. They're using them in very intimate ways in a chat interface. They're revealing their thoughts, their feelings, their intent. So,
Yes.
yeah.
We have a question. Once missing evidence is determined, so we were talking about those gaps that might be turned up, who do you hire to look into getting more information? That depends on the context. If you're in litigation, that's going to be through the attorneys, and they're going to be either, if it's your own client, looking to collect additional data or understand why it's not there. And if it's the other side, you're going to be following up with requests and meet and confers and potentially a spoliation argument down the road.
Or you may potentially need to hire a forensics expert to do a deeper dive into data if there is no there
Yes.
there.
Depending on what type of data you're talking about and whether it still exists in its original format or not, then you're going to have different layers of people involved. And that's different if it's an internal investigation. Obviously, you've got different answers to that same question. Um, have any of the panelists asked the system to review your own privilege log before sending to the opposing side and asked it to identify issues likely to be questioned by the other side? Yes, and I think that's an excellent use. I really do. So not just in the privilege log context, but always like probe this, test this, tell me the weaknesses, tell me where it's likely to be challenged. Will always give you better work product. So I think that's an excellent use for AI overall. So before we kind of sign off on our section and turn it over to Doug Austin's very interesting summary of recent developments on hallucination, how about if we just give every panelist an opportunity to leave us with one parting thought?
My parting thought to anyone, whether you are a technologist or a legal professional working in this space. There are a lot of applications that are out there with a lot of promises. And my observation is that many of these tools are immature and not really fit for the purpose that they're advertising them for. They often don't scale and they don't have a lot of auditability built into the tool so that you can trace your steps through what you did. So be thoughtful about how you use your technologies and which tools you're selecting to ensure that they're giving you the information about your own work and that of your team so that you can defend the results.
I guess my
would say
parting
the
thought kind of dovetails with what Martha just said in that you've probably seen through this presentation a lot of things that look very similar. Some of the testing against known documents. That's the same thing that we used to call a control set 10 years ago. A lot of the processes that you're going to employ with Gen AI are not that different from what you did with previous forms of analytics and AI, but you have to tweak them just a bit to understand these are much more powerful tools that have fewer guardrails and boundaries on them than the old tools that we used to use. So understanding the nature of the differences between what you've been doing for the past 5 years and what you now have to do with a tool that's doing 4 or 5 other functions, with a few of them more obscure than they used to be, is really where the key is in designing a workflow that's going to be really defensible and still be incredibly effective and efficient for you.
Yeah, I would echo both of those statements. And my point, I guess, always comes back to there's no substitute for understanding. So again, it's not an easy button. You can't turn judgment or even just responsibility for the underlying data over to anyone, much less a machine, right? So use it for its strengths, leverage what it's able to give you in terms of analytics and information gathering, but ultimately you should be able to, or your defense counsel should be able to stand up in court and speak to the overall process. You don't have to be an expert, but you do need to know what happened so that, one, you can identify deficiencies when they arise, and two, you can speak to them defensively later on.
Thank you. I agree with all of that. My takeaway will be come see the next sessions of this series to learn more about AI and how it's impacting our practices. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Doug Austin via pre-recorded video, but a very interesting one.
Hi, I'm Doug Austin, editor of eDiscovery Today, a daily blog about eDiscovery, cybersecurity, data privacy, information governance, and AI trends, best practices, and case law. Here's your AI trends update for April 2026 as they relate to legal and eDiscovery professionals. This month, I'm reporting on AI hallucination trends in legal, how they relate to eDiscovery, and what you should do about them. Of course, I should mention that any ideas expressed by me are my own, not those of my organization, clients, or partners. The protection of disclaimers is no hallucination. Also, just a reminder that eDiscovery Today reports and papers are available free to email subscribers of eDiscovery Today at ediscoverytoday.com. The first one you see here on evaluating methods for review was just released on Monday. Many of you may be familiar with the tendency of large language AI models to hallucinate. Probably the biggest indicator of that in legal is the AI hallucination cases site created by Damien Charlatan last year, which tracks legal decisions and cases involving hallucinated content with Gen AI. A lot of people are finding cases to send to Damien for inclusion, including me, because as of Monday, there were 1,333 cases in the site with hallucinations since
I think we lost the audio on this one.
Yeah.
for legal.
Oh, there it is.
So what are
I'll back up a bit.
786 cases in 2025. We already have 470 cases in 2026, a pace that puts us on target for over 1,600 cases by the end of the year. With those kinds of numbers, it's enough to make many in the legal profession scream the sky is falling regarding the use of AI for legal. So what are courts doing about it? For starters, we've seen a number of standing orders and other instructions issued by courts where they've said if you use Gen AI, you have to tell us you used it and confirm you verified the outputs. Courts have also increased sanctions for filings with hallucinations, including monetary fines, ordered COE, even dismissal of the case, ordering attorneys to send the sanctions order to their other clients, and reporting them to the state bar. Still, reported cases have risen dramatically. Why? One reason is that this isn't just a lawyer problem. Most of the cases involve pro se parties who think AI models like ChatGPT crank out a mean court filing. Simply getting all the lawyers on board isn't the answer. Education and understanding why and how hallucinations occur is the key. It's important to understand that large language models don't actually know anything. They're highly trained word predictors trained on trillions of inputs that often don't get it right. So do you have to worry about hallucinations in eDiscovery? Sure, but there are differences. First is how the models are trained. Public LLMs generate new evidence and can invent facts, while eDiscovery solutions operate on a fixed corpus of data. They can still hallucinate, but those are often misinterpretations, not invented facts. Also, in eDiscovery solutions, the outputs can be traced back. Most solutions provide a link to the source info for you to verify the accuracy of what the model says. You typically can't do that with public LLMs. So what should you do as an e-discovery professional? First, trust but verify. You need to confirm the information the model provides is correct. You can do that by tying the findings to the evidence itself. It's table stakes now for e-discovery solutions to support that. Also use traditional validation techniques that we've applied to TAR to the GenAI outputs. They work there too. Don't just stick with the same workflows. They need to be updated to support GenAI. And finally, document, document, document for defensibility. That's it for the AI Trends Update for April 2026. See you next month, and thanks for having me.
I will quickly close and just say thank you very much to Angela, Brandon, Joel Henry, and Martha. What a great session. Does anyone have any final thoughts on the way out?
Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks everyone for
Pleasure to
attending.
speak with
I
everyone.
had a great time and thought it was a wonderful discussion.
Yeah.
Thank
And
you. Thank you, everyone.
thanks so much.